They pushed me out of my own house the day I found out I wasn't invited to my son's wedding. It wasn't a dramatic scene with slammed doors at first. It was a small, smiling lie from Lena. She said, easy as anyone might say the weather, "We only invited close family, Mama. You know how it is." She said it with a tone that made the words feel like a kindness. That was the cruelest part, the gentleness with which they closed the door. I still remember the pink dress hanging in my closet, the one I bought the summer after Robert died. I bought it because I thought, foolishly as it turned out, that if I kept looking presentable, kept doing for them, kept being available, they'd show up in my life in more than moments of need. The dress was folded now under a pile of blankets, and when Lena said close family, I could feel the fabric like a bruise across my chest. I put my hand on that dress, and I said out loud, "You invited whom?" She laughed, a nervous thing. "We already married, Mama. It was small. You wouldn't have liked the crowd anyway." Lied to my face. The voice that always used to call me Mama now said it as if it was a formality, a title she owed me because of biology and nothing more. I sat down then, in a chair by the window where the light always lands in the morning, and I pulled out the checkbook. I won't pretend I wasn't blind. I had been generous, maybe too generous. I had been a widow, with a house to keep and a heart that kept wanting to buy safety and affection. After Robert died, Max came home to live with me for a while. Then he stayed. Then he married Lena, and I kept opening my pocketbook. I made a list right there. Numbers make a story hard to argue with. 3 years, 36 months, and a stack of bank statements that looked like a confession. There were the rent transfers I set up because they were late sometimes. $500 a month, automatically pulled. That alone ate $18,000 across 3 years. There were the car repairs, $3,200, medical copays I paid so they could get care without insurance hiccups, $1,450, groceries and household bills meant for 4 people when there were only 2, another $2,800, the emergency cash I wired when Max called in a panic several times, totaling $7,950. I could show the receipts. I could show the dates. When I added it all up, the number looked back at me like betrayal, roughly $33,400. It wasn't just the money. It was the shape of their words. "You don't understand court paperwork. You get mixed up with dates. We're only trying to help." Phrases repeated in the same way over months, like a script rehearsed to wear me down. The pattern had a rhythm: need, appeal, payment, gratitude, then need again. It created a dependence that felt like love at first, until you noticed that when the favor stopped, the warmth did too. So I did 2 things that changed everything. The first was practical. I called the bank and canceled the automatic transfers. I closed a line of easy credit they'd grown used to. I personally went to the branch and, with my ID in hand, asked them to freeze any access they had. It felt like slamming a window shut against rain. The second thing I did, the one I didn't think I would need, was to change the locks. I remember the afternoon I called the locksmith. The man who came had hands that looked like he did the work with them all his life, grease in the creases, a gentle economy to his motion. He looked at me and said, "You live here alone?" I said yes. He asked if I had anyone who came by. I said yes again, and I watched the word come into the room with me. Used to come by. He didn't judge. He handed me a small flat key. "You're doing the right thing," he said. Maybe I needed him to tell me that. I locked the old key away, and I put the new one in my favorite drawer, the one that had old stamps from Robert's letters and a postcard from when we'd gone to Florida. That night, Max and Lena came by. They hadn't called. They just came. I answered the door because I thought for a moment that maybe it was a misunderstanding. When they saw the new locks, they looked annoyed, then angry. Max tried to make a joke about me getting older and worried about burglars. Lena said I was making life difficult for everyone. I told them calmly to leave. Max took a breath like he was going to push. He didn't, not that day, but his jaw tightened. There was calculation and surprise in his face. I felt that in my bones, the moment a child realizes money won't be there to fix every problem. We argued about things then I had never argued about with him. He stepped into my kitchen and opened a drawer as if he owned the space. He fumbled through a pile of papers and pulled out the checkbook. "Why would you do this?" he asked, like I was in the wrong for wanting to close the faucet that had been rifling away our dignity. "Because I am tired," I said, "and because you lied to me about the wedding." "You're overreacting," Lena said. "You're making a scene." They brought along a man with them the next time, a man with a card that said he was a lawyer. He sat at my kitchen table and folded his hands like he was making a proposal, papers in neat stacks. "We're concerned about your mother's mental capacity," he said to Max, but his eyes kept flicking to me like he was evaluating a display. That was the word that brought the whole thing into the open: competence. Competence, or the lack of it, can make your house disappear. Competence or no competence can give your life into the hands of someone else. They said, with the kind of voice that wants to be reasonable, that they were thinking about a guardianship. They suggested a power of attorney. They said it would make things simpler, easier. They said it would be for her protection. You can hear that and say, "I'm protected." You can see how that can sound like love. But when the persons who want this protection are the ones who have been taking money, the phrase turns like a blade. I told them no. I said, "You will not come into my house and poke through my things." I said, "You will not sign anything with my name without me being there and clear about it." I stood up, I took the papers off the table, and I set them in the middle of the floor, and I told them to leave. They left incensed. The lawyer shrugged like he had expected resistance. Max's face was small with shame and fury. Lena gathered herself like she was at an actor's call for the next scene. After they left, I did something very unlike me. I called a lawyer. Mr. Weber was recommended by Eleanor from my garden club. Eleanor is a small woman with big rings who waters other people's plants when they go away. She has a voice that sounds like gravel and honey. She came over that week and sat with me at the kitchen table, and she said flatly, "You need someone who knows how to read this." She held my hands in both of hers and said, "You do not deserve to be treated like an insufficient person because of your age." Mr. Weber's office smelled like paper and civility. He was a man who did not yell. He did not need to. He asked questions that made me want to cry, because they laid bare what had been happening under the blue tarp of my own good intentions. He asked about transfers, dates, bank names. He wanted my receipts. He wanted witnesses who could say I was clear and capable. He wanted someone who could testify about how I managed my affairs. "I can't promise any courtroom," he said in the first meeting, and I remember it because it was the most honest thing anyone had said in weeks. "But we can make it very difficult for them to call you incompetent if you have records, if you have a pattern of managing your money, and if you have people who can say you're lucid and participative." He explained things without telling me what to do. He talked about evidence, about experts, about how words like concern are weaponized, about how to make sure the story they tell in court isn't the only story. That first afternoon after I hired him, I went out to the cemetery. Robert had been dead 5 years by then. I sat on the bench by the grave that still had his favorite coins tucked under a stone. I talked to him like someone who needed to clear the air. I said, "We raised him together," I said. "We taught him right from wrong. I don't want our life to be turned into a spectacle." I imagined his hands calloused from a lifetime of work, and I thought of the letters he used to write, short notes he tucked into pockets or under plates that said simple things like, "Feed the dog," or "Don't forget your appointment." He was a man who wasn't given to speeches, but he had a kind of quiet moral gravity. I wondered what he would have said to Max if he were here. The next morning, Mr. Weber called me with something I didn't expect. He said they had found a sealed letter among Robert's papers, a small thing, folded and tucked away in a place where only I or Robert knew to look. He sounded careful when he told me this, like someone who had waited a long time to say something that might ease a wound. "It's addressed to Max," he said, "or at least it's labeled that way. He left instructions for what should happen if there was trouble about the caretaking when you weren't well." I felt an odd lightness at the news, and then a coldness. The letter itself could be nothing. It could be a will-like thing with no legal teeth. Mr. Weber told me that on the phone. He told me the letter wouldn't legally prevent anyone from filing for guardianship. He said it was a moral document at best. But sometimes, he said, the right words read at the right time do a lot of work. So we had papers. We had witnesses. We had a camera that Mr. Weber suggested I put on the porch to record any unannounced visits.
Eleanor helped me choose it. She's the kind of friend who will stand with you in a hardware store and give you the look when you try to pick the flimsiest thing. You need one that records when the motion sensor goes off, she said, not one that takes pretty videos of your roses. I started making lists in a notebook I carried everywhere. I listed the transfers, the dates, what they were for. I wrote down the names of people who could say I was managing my life. Cynthia at the pharmacy, who always saw me balancing my pills and my checkbook. Eleanor, who knew when I paid them for the lawn. The woman from the garden club, who watched the mailbox and could swear I was capable. I wrote down the names of the doctors who had seen me for regular checkups and could say I was engaged and oriented. I wrote down the times the transfers had been set up and the contacts I had when Max called about money. I also started keeping the small things, photos of the pink dress in the closet, the sofa I'd bought because I wanted my home to be comfortable, the postcard Robert had once sent from a fishing trip that said "Only miss you" in shaky handwriting. I took pictures of those things and put them in a folder for Mr. Weber. He said the layers of ordinary life, the evidence that I paid bills, that I went to church, that I managed my household, would help show the judge I was not someone to be swept aside. That night, Max came back. He had that look again, the one I now understood as equal parts entitlement and frustration. He marched in and grabbed the mail from the table. My old neighbor, Mr. Green, who had been at the door for a beans and corn casserole, was there, and he raised an eyebrow at Max's impatience. "Too big for his britches," Mr. Green said under his breath, and that small approval warmed me like sunlight. Max held an envelope like a weapon. "Where's the letter?" he demanded. I told him I didn't know what he was talking about. He said Robert had left instructions that should be honored.
Lena put a hand to her mouth and made a sound like a cat. "We just want what's right for her," she said, the phrase the way a mask covers a face. That's when the escalation began. The tone shifted. They started bringing up doctors' names, phrases like memory lapses and confusion. They said things that sounded like worry, but smelled of strategy. Max's friends stopped by, then his brothers, then a man with a clipboard who wanted to interview me about my sleep patterns. I answered politely, because it's hard to be rude when your child's life is at stake. I smiled, and I told them the truth. I sleep fine. I pay my bills. I keep my keys in a drawer and my watch on my wrist. But the questions kept coming. One evening, after a long day of gathering statements from Cynthia and Eleanor and sitting through Mr. Weber's questions about which accounts were in my name, I went upstairs and opened Robert's old cedar chest. It's a thing I go to when I'm looking for a piece of him. A frayed shirt, a ticket stub, the small hand-carved fishing lure he used to keep for luck. There, under a folded shirt, I found an envelope. The outside had handwriting I recognized instantly. It was his. It was not the same as the sealed letter Mr. Weber had told me about. It was different, smaller, less formal, a note tucked by hand. I unfolded it, and there were 3 lines. He'd written in a way he did when he was in a hurry, the pencil slow and decisive. "Rainity, I know you have a good heart. Take care of yourself. Make them earn your love, not the other way around. Love, R." That's not something that would win a courtroom by itself, but it was proof of what I had felt in my bones for years, that Robert had seen the way the world could take advantage of softness, and had tried to give me a little instruction to keep my dignity. It mattered to me in the dark nights when loneliness showed its teeth. The true trouble was the other letter. The one Mr. Weber had mentioned was tucked away, perhaps in a safety deposit or within the lawyer's files. He said they had a way to retrieve it. He said, cautiously, that if it were what he suspected, it might sway a neighbor or a friend, or even a jurist's sense of the family's history. That's not a legal claim. He said it was the sort of thing that human beings listen to when plain evidence moves them but cannot tell the whole story. When they filed for guardianship, and I didn't realize how soon they would do it, the papers arrived like winter. A polite envelope at first, then a certified letter. The plaintiffs were Max and Lena. Their lawyer wrote that they were concerned for the safety and well-being of a senior citizen who lived alone. I read the phrase and felt smaller than the paper it was printed on. Mr. Weber moved like a general planning for a siege. He asked me who had visited, who had access to my house, which bank accounts were jointly held, and which were mine alone.
He asked me to sign authorizations for a psychiatric evaluation, not because he thought I needed it, but because he knew the other side would bring such a report, and he wanted mine on file. He told me the name of a doctor who had evaluated elders in the past with fairness, Dr. Moore. The day Dr. Moore examined me, I wore the pink dress under a cardigan. It felt like armor. He asked about my medications, my routines, how I paid bills, and whether my memory had lapses. I told him truthfully that sometimes I forgot a name or a place, but that I could balance a checkbook and knew the difference between a Monday and a Saturday. He watched my hands when I told him how I sorted the mail and how I kept my appointments, and he tapped a pen and wrote down notes. "He's a fair man," Mr. Weber said later when we spoke at his office. "A measured report from Dr. Moore will look good. We want the judge to see that you can function and that your son's concern is, at best, selective." I had never wanted to be in court. It felt like lying under a bright light. But there's a peculiar clarity to being forced into a public defense. It makes you stack the things you love into neat piles for examination. It makes you pick the receipts that tell the truth you want to be seen. Neighbors came. Eleanor came with a casserole and a box of old photos. Cynthia from the pharmacy sat with me in my living room and told the world she had watched me count pills and pay cash and keep my appointments. The woman from the garden club, Diana, brought a list of the times I paid for community plantings and the dates I signed up for potluck duty. Even Mr. Green wrote a letter about how he'd watched me take care of my house over the years. Max and Lena tried a different approach in the meantime. They started a narrative about my forgetfulness that included details only a person who had been in the house would know. Dates I'd missed a rent notice because they hadn't forwarded it, a check I'd overlooked because it had been hidden in a stack of their mail. Mr. Weber called that what it was, a selective recounting of mistakes marshaled to suggest a larger incapacity. Want to know the thing that stings most? It wasn't the money they wanted, it was the control. Money bought them groceries and reassurance. But what they wanted was the ability to make decisions about me, the right to say where I would live, what doctors I would see, where my money would go. They wanted to write the script for the last acts of my life. We scheduled a hearing. The court date was a small, cold thing in my calendar, a square in black ink. The morning we went, Mr. Weber brought a stack of documents carefully bound. He had the bank statements, the receipts, the letters from witnesses. He had my calendar, my medication list, and the report from Dr. Moore.
He had photographs of my house, notes from my neighbors, and even a short statement from the pastor who had married Robert and me. One of those small pieces of background that says, in plain language, this woman has lived a consistent, functioning life. Max sat across the courtroom from me, looking older than his years. He looked like a man surprised by his own actions. Lena sat with him, tight as if she were waiting for applause that never came. The other lawyers shuffled paper and spoke in that quiet way adults do when they are deciding a child's future. At one point, a man from the other side stood and told the judge, in the generic tones of legal concern, that they were not seeking to take away my independence out of malice, but out of protection. He read a litany of small incidents and painted a picture of an isolated woman who had trouble with finances. Their evidence was a kind of mosaic made up of the worst day in a life, blown up and framed. Mr. Weber rose slowly. He did not grandstand. He did not shout. He pointed quietly to the folder of bank statements and said, "If the court will look at the records, they will see a pattern of deliberate management. These transfers were gifts, documented, not results of fraud or coercion, and there are neighbors willing to say she is capable." He spoke to the person we all look for in the room, the judge, who sat with a face that had seen many such small tragedies. And then the moment came that made the room change. It was not the kind of moment that happens in a single burst. It was a movement, an intake of breath, a shift in the air you felt in the shoulders of the people who were leaning forward. Mr. Weber had something else to offer, he said, something personal but consequential. He asked permission to present a letter. Max's face changed. A light went out. Lena's mouth went tight. He said it was written by the late Robert, Max's father. It's a private letter he left, addressed to Max, about how to treat his mother in times of dispute. He did not call it evidence, only a record of what Robert had thought. He said he would read a short excerpt. I felt the room tilt. You could hear the small whisper of paper. I felt my throat tighten. My hands went into my lap and they were shaking. This was not the proof that would legally close the case. We had agreed on that. He had warned me that the letter might not be admissible in the way we hoped, but someone had found it, and the moment they mentioned Robert, I felt him there, as if he had stepped into the courtroom in his old blue jacket. Max stood up. He looked as though he might speak, but he stopped. He stared at the lawyer instead, as if the paper could not possibly have anything but a betrayal of him. For a second, I saw his boyish face, the child who used to sit under the table and listen to us argue about which seed to plant in spring. I saw that face, and I felt that old tenderness I had tried to buy with checks and transfers.
Weber cleared his throat. He folded the paper with slow, respectful motions. He touched it like it was something given in trust. "I'm going to read only 3 lines," he said. "The judge, the record, the family, they deserve the clarity." I remember thinking then, letters don't make law. They don't turn scales on their own. But sometimes they tell the truth people have tried to hide. Sometimes a small sentence can reveal the heart of a household better than a sequence of members ever could. That's where the story strangled and sat, heavy and full of expectation. The lawyer's lips moved, a quiet thing in the hush. I watched Max. I watched Lena. I watched the judge's hand hover over a file. I could feel my life held in that hallway between the sentence and the next one. Someone in the gallery shifted. The air tasted like pennies and coffee. I realized then how close I had come to losing the thing that had been mine for decades. A house, yes, but also the right to decide the shape of my days. I thought of the pink dress in the closet and of the cedar chest where Robert kept the tokens of our life together. I thought of all the evenings I'd sat on the porch with a cup of tea and planned nothing. I thought of how lonely you get when the people closest to you decide that protection is an excuse to replace you. And then, before the lawyer could read, the bailiff asked the court to recess for a moment while he verified the document's providence. The whisper of the room got louder. Max's shoulders moved like someone deflating a balloon. The bailiff left. A judge tapped his pen, more to fill the silence than anything else. Mr. Weber folded his hands. There was a pause, in which I heard my own breath. I thought of everything I had done to get here. The canceled transfers, the locks, the neighbors, the camera on the porch that had caught Lena's knock a week before at 2 a.m., the statements from Cynthia and Diana, the pink dress that only I knew the hem of, the receipt for the sofa I had bought so my back would not ache when I sat, the little note Robert had tucked under a plate years ago. Miss you. You can prepare all the documents in the world. You can have Dr. Moore's calm assessment and a stack of receipts. But in that room, it was the human thing, a scrap of paper written by a dead man, that made a person stop and remember who we used to be. It was about memory and moral compulsion, and the way a voice from the past can pierce a present lie. When the bailiff returned, I felt the room lean toward the paper, like everyone was waiting to see whether a ghost would speak. Mr. Weber unfolded it. He began to read. He began to read. The paper trembled a little in his hands, as if it felt the weight of everything it carried. The room shrank down to the sound of his voice. Mr. Weber read plainly, without flourish, and the lines landed like small stones falling into water.
Max, he read, if you ever must choose between what you want and what is right, choose what is right. Your mother gave you life and taught you respect. Do not mistake her kindness for weakness. Protect her. Do not take from her. R. 3 short lines, no grand pronouncements, no legalese. Just a man reminding his son of the simple things he was supposed to know. You could feel the air change. It was not a legal argument, it was a moral one. People in the gallery leaned forward as if to hear more, though there was nothing more to the sentence. Max looked like someone who had been struck by a hand he did not expect. Lena's face went paper white. She clutched her purse as though it might slip through her fingers. The judge closed his eyes for a breath. I felt warmth in the back of my throat, and something like relief and dread all at once. Then Max stood up. He did not storm out, he did not shout. He walked to the bench as if he were walking to a shrine, and then stopped halfway. For a moment he looked as if he might speak the kind of apology that could begin to stitch what had been torn. His mouth opened and closed, his face softened and then hardened again. In his eyes I saw the boy who had scraped his knee on the porch step and coming crying, the boy who had once asked to learn to fish with his father. For a second the old tenderness came at me plain and raw. He did not say anything that helped. He said instead, "Your Honor, this letter is irrelevant. It's private family business. It doesn't change the facts." That was true. It didn't change the facts. The transfers still existed. The camera footage still showed Lena knocking at odd hours. The receipts were still in my folder. Dr. Moore's evaluation would still stand or fall on its own. But the letter did something numbers could not do. It drew a line from an earlier life into this one. It reminded a room full of strangers that there had been a moral architecture around me, even if some people had chosen to ignore it. Mr. Weber closed the paper and asked Dr. Moore a few more questions about my capacities.
Dr. Moore spoke steadily, as he always did, about orientation, about the difference between occasional forgetfulness and a pattern of decline that would warrant guardianship. He said plainly that in his evaluation, I demonstrated the ability to manage daily life and make reasoned decisions. He acknowledged I had normal aging moments, names forgotten, a misplaced bill now and again, but he described me as engaged with my affairs, able to recall recent events, and competent to direct my own care. Then came the testimony that Mr. Weber had prepared with care. Cynthia from the pharmacy described the way I managed medications, how I came in to pick up prescriptions and paid my bills with attention. Eleanor told the court about the garden club and how I scheduled plantings and potlucks and paid my share without fail.
Diana read from the list of years I had volunteered and the checks she had seen me write for community projects. Mr. Green, who could not tolerate unnecessary drama, said plainly he'd seen me balance my checkbook and plan for winterizing the house. Each witness was small and ordinary, people who had seen the daily proof of how I lived. When it was my turn to speak, I told the truth. I said I had given money to Max because I loved him and because I wanted him to have a step up after Robert died. I said I regretted not seeing the pattern sooner. I said I had taken steps to protect myself because I loved my home and my independence. I did not try to make excuses. I did not ask for pity. I only wanted the judge to see me as I was, a woman who had mistakes and generosity and the right to decide for herself. On cross-examination, the other lawyer tried to pull at the threads. He pointed out missed dates, a check written late, the times Max had taken food from the kitchen because he was late from work. He spoke in a voice that wanted to be measured, but which thinned toward accusation. "Is it not true," he asked me, "that you sometimes forget where you put things, that you have been late on your taxes, that you once left the stove on?" "Yes," I said, "yes to some of that. But I also pay my taxes, and I have never been hospitalized for confusion. I have a mail system I use and neighbors who know my routine. I am not perfect, but I am capable." He tried to trap me with words, to make the occasional slip seem like a foundation for a life. Mr. Weber's work was to show the judge the shape of my life beyond those slips, the entire stack of ordinary competence. He did it without spectacle. He let the receipts speak, the witnesses speak, Dr. Moore speak, and the letter that had been hidden speak its modest truth. At the end of the day, the judge retired to his chambers to consider the evidence, a cold, small room, perhaps better suited for light decisions, but when human lives are on the line, it becomes a place where a life is held and turned over like a coin between fingers. We sat in the hallway like a congregation waiting for a pastor to come out with the verdict. Eleanor held my hand. Cynthia sat stiffly, as if she were bracing for a punch. Mr. Green smoked too many cigarettes that week and kept muttering things under his breath that made the nurses at the courthouse glance our way. When the judge returned, the air in the room felt like it would break if we all inhaled too deeply. He read his findings in a voice that tried to be kind and clear. He spoke of evidence and burden and the standard the court must apply. He said guardianship was an extraordinary step reserved for when a person's incapacity left them unable to make essential decisions. He spoke of the right to independence and the risk of using guardianship as a device for control. He acknowledged the concerns raised by Max and Lena.
He acknowledged their reports of missed bills and the fear a child may feel for a parent. Then he reached the point the room had held its breath for. He found that, on the balance of the evidence presented, the plaintiffs had not met the burden to show that Renati lacked capacity sufficient to require a guardian. He denied the petition for guardianship. There was a release that came with that sentence, as if a knot in my chest unthreaded itself from the inside. I did not think, at that moment, about the years ahead. I thought only of the small things, the pink dress folded away in my closet, the cedar chest with Robert's things, the way my hands used to cup his when we walked down the block. I think the first thing I did after we left the courtroom was to sit in Mr. Weber's office and cry, not from triumph, but from exhaustion and from grief. Mr. Weber did not make a speech. He pressed a tissue into my hand and told me quietly that he was glad I had my life back. He reminded me that I had done the work to keep myself. There was no parade, no town crier. The victory was not a headline. It was simply the right to keep living as I had chosen. The judge's decision did not mean reconciliation. It did not mean Max would return to caring behaviors. It meant he would not be given power over my person and my estate by the court. After the hearing, there were attempts at rapprochement. Max called that night, his voice thin and apologetic.
"Mama, I'm sorry about how things went," he said. "I didn't mean to hurt you." I listened. I wanted to trust. I wanted to be able to take the apology and fold it into my life. But the pattern had train tracks worn into it. You cannot unwalk the path with one step across it. He came by my house a week later with Lena. They stood at the front gate, respectful distance, like strangers, holding a small cake and saying the kinds of things people say when they want to smooth rough edges. I let them in because I wanted to see if a bridge could be rebuilt. We sat at the table and ate a piece of cake. He spoke of mistakes and of a new job he had taken. Lena said she was learning. They suggested a repayment plan without numbers, as if that might make everything neat. "We'll start returning what we can, Mama." It sounded like a draft of the old script. Ask, receive, say thank you, ask again. I watched them and I listened and I felt that familiar pull. "Thank you," I said, "for the cake." And I added simply, "I'd like to see it in writing." That small insistence, the insistence on documentation, was the difference between being mother and being bank. It was not vindictiveness. It was clarity. They left the cake and did not return the following week. A month later, there was an envelope on my porch with a check for a portion of what had been taken. It covered some car repairs and a chunk of groceries. It was not the whole thing, but it was a start.
Max was making payments in a way that seemed to suit him. Occasional, not steady. Enough to say he had tried, but not enough to repair the pattern of dependency. Over the next year, I did things I had said I would do in whispers to myself long before the courtroom. I sold the house. That decision, sell the house, felt at first like another loss, and then like a shedding. The house had been a container of memories, and also, increasingly, the scene of conflict. I wanted a life that was mine, but lighter. Mr. Weber helped me find an agent who listened to my desire for safety and community more than for square footage. We found a neat apartment with sunlight in the mornings and a balcony that looked over a small garden courtyard. It was manageable and modern, and best of all, it felt like a new chapter. Selling the house was a ritualized letting go. I hired someone to pack my things with respect. We wrapped Robert's fishing lure in cotton. I gave the pink dress to the woman at the church thrift shop because it felt right that the dress might be worn by someone who needed a little shine for a different reason. I kept the cedar chest and the postcard he had sent saying, "Miss you." I also kept the checkbook, not as a weapon, but as proof that until this time I had been careful enough to keep records. The proceeds from the sale of the house were not my only inheritance. I donated a portion to a local elder rights organization, an act I wanted to turn my pain into something that could help others. That donation felt like armor for the kind of loneliness that has no obvious philanthropy. I wanted other women to have someone to call when a strange man in a neat suit arrived at their kitchen table. I used some of the money to pay off lingering debts and to set up a small emergency fund that could not be accessed by anyone else. I had the accounts titled in a way that felt right to me. I spoke to a financial advisor once, not to be told steps to take, but to have a professional explain things clearly. Nothing in that process was glamorous. It was sensible and practical, and for once, about me. I also did something brash and wild. I bought a plane ticket to a place Robert and I had talked about going when we were younger, a fishing town by the Gulf where the air smelled of salt and gasoline and fried food. I went alone. I sat on the pier and watched the boats, thinking about the way Robert had taught me to watch lines and currents. I painted there, clumsy at first, then with a kind of joy I had not known in years. I took a class at a community center and learned to mix colors that made me feel like the world had new dimensions. Painting became a way to remember Robert and to make something that belonged only to me. I sold a small canvas at a church fair and used the money to buy paints of better quality. The garden club came with me to an exhibit I had in a small cafe. Eleanor cried the first night and clutched my hand.
"You did what you had to do," she said between her teeth. "You stood up for yourself." I wanted to tell her it was not bravery so much as stubbornness, and that sometimes stubbornness looks like surviving. Max's presence in my life dwindled. He sent a postcard from time to time, short notes about work, a new baby rumored somewhere, a new girlfriend. He called on my birthday one year and sang off-key to me. I laughed and told him to practice. That was the kind of relationship we limped into. Cautious, courteous, wary. He never came to stay.
He never asked again to move back in. I do not know if that is punishment or protection. Maybe it's both. There were moments of sorrow that did not diminish in a neat line. I would open a closet and feel the echo of his absence. I would see a photograph and the world would ache a little. But those sorrows had room for other things: color and travel, classes, and the gentle company of friends who had not wanted money, but had wanted me. Months after the trial, someone from the Elder Rights Organization called me and asked if I would speak to a group of caregivers. "We need your story," she said. "People need to know what it looks like. They need to see how to protect dignity and how to ask for help." Speaking was not something I expected to do, but I found I could tell what had happened without shame. I could say the words and watch people nod, some with tears, some with clenched faces. I told them about the locks, the camera, the checkbook, the letter, the courtroom. I insisted that the letter did not make the judge rule any one way. I said it made people listen. The story of the letter traveled in small circles. Neighbors told neighbors. Someone at church mentioned it in a prayer, not to make it holy, but to make it human. I began to get letters from women who had had similar experiences. Short notes in shaky handwriting, long typed messages, emails forwarded by people who wanted me to read them. "We thought we were doing the right thing," many of them wrote. Then we woke up. When I came to the end of telling my story to a room of caregivers, an older woman in the back stood and took my hands. She had hair like crinkled paper and a laugh that smelled of mint. "You made us brave," she said. "You made us believe the court might listen." She did not say the court always would. She did not say the letter would always be found or read. She said only that what I had done, standing up, had made courage contagious. There were times I still wondered about what had been lost. I wondered if more could have been done to soften Max's path. I wondered if Robert, had he lived, would have done more than write a line on paper. I wondered sometimes if my insistence on independence had simply forced him out. Those are hard thoughts, and you learn to let them sit without letting them rule. What I learned most was about the currency of dignity. I had thought for years that money could buy safety and affection. It cannot.
Money can buy convenience, a microwave, a van, a few worry-free months, but it cannot purchase respect. Respect is earned and maintained in the small things, how you speak to someone, whether you knock at midnight, whether you ask before you take. Money without those things is a fragile throne. That is when the letter mattered most. It did not overturn the law. It did not act as an automatic veto on anyone's claims. What it did was tell a truthful thing in a way that numbers could not, that there had been expectation and instruction in my family about how to care for the elders. It reminded Max, publicly, painfully, that his father believed in a standard he should honor. It influenced how people heard him. It became a moral fact in a place that was being asked to decide a legal one. In the months and years that followed, I began to speak to students at the local community college and to volunteers at shelters. I taught a small class on record keeping for elders, how to keep copies of receipts, who to call, how to find a friend who will bear witness. I did not give legal advice. I told them what had worked for me and what I had wished I had known earlier. I told them to name the accounts, to keep a list of transfers, and to find a neighbor who will write a note if strange things start to happen. People asked me small, delicate questions. I answered them in plain speech. I refused to be shaming. I wanted them to leave with more than fear. I wanted them to leave with tools to protect their peace. Sometimes people ask me if I regret giving the money. They ask if I would do it all again. I try not to answer simply yes or no, because life is not a math problem. I gave of what I had because I loved my child, and because in those first years after Robert, the house felt too quiet. I would have given less had I known how to set boundaries earlier, but I do not think my love was wrong. Misapplied perhaps, misread perhaps, but not wrong. Other times they ask me if I forgave Max. Forgiveness is not one event, it is a weather pattern. Sometimes the clouds thin and I feel forgiving. Sometimes the rain comes and I am raw again. I choose, more often than not, to wish him well from a distance. I pray for him and for myself in ways that are private and honest. I do not make myself small to keep a child nearby. I make him responsible for his own life. People who come to see me now are often surprised by the brightness of my days. They expect to see bitterness, not paint. They expect to see hard lines instead of laughter. I tell them the truth. I am older and often tired,
but I am also more myself than I have been in years. I wake up and make coffee for me and sometimes for a friend. I sign up for parks classes and I plant tomatoes in a window box that seeps toward the sun. When the tomatoes ripen, I give a basket to Eleanor and to the woman who lives across from me and who will not accept money but will accept a pie.
Once, at a small community meeting about elder care, a young mother stood up and said, "You changed my mind about asking for help." She told the group that after hearing my story, she had gone home and sat with her father, and they had made a plan together, simple steps with signatures and a list of 2 neighbors to call. She had been afraid of sounding distrustful, of accusing her dad of failing, but instead she had found a way to preserve his agency while protecting his safety. That was a moment of deep satisfaction for me. It felt like the letter had done more work than just sway a courtroom. It had opened a conversation. Max's life carried on in the way most lives do, in fits and starts, and small achievements and stumbles. I heard that he had a child once, a granddaughter who loved sun hats and the smell of cinnamon. I received a photograph of the baby, and I kept it in a small frame by the window. I do not know if Max reads the speeches I give, or if he ever thinks about the things his father wrote. Maybe he does. Maybe he does not. That is no longer mine to decide. When the anniversary of the courtroom came around, Eleanor brought over pie and cards. We sat on the balcony, and I told a few neighbors the story again, not to relive it, but to remind us of where we had been. There is a place in the story for grief and for gratitude, for both the loss of what I had expected and the gain of what I found. If there is a moral, if anyone needs one spelled out, it is this: protections exist for a reason, but so does agency. If someone you love begins to ask for things in a pattern that feels like it is taking from you more than giving, notice it. If someone feels unreasonably entitled, call a friend who can help bear witness. Keep records, keep your checkbook, keep your letters, and where possible, find a community that will stand with you when you have to defend what is yours. I did not plan to become the person who spoke at meetings or who lent her story to organizers. Life pushed me into that role. The thing I had wanted my money to buy, connection, came in another way, not bought, but built. Friends arrived who had nothing to do with my bank account. They came because I was myself, because I could be present without being a wallet. It was a lesson paid for with tears and with small, hard decisions, but it was a lesson. People ask about the letter, the one Robert wrote. They ask if it was dramatic or long or wise. It was short and direct, like him. He had never been a man of long speeches. He had been a man who showed love by fixing a screen door or by tucking a coin into a pocket. That one line, "Do not mistake her kindness for weakness," was enough to change how people heard Max in that room. It brought a dead man's moral gravity into a space that was otherwise full of ledger lines and witness statements. That is all it did. It made people listen differently. It changed the mood in a room.
And sometimes, when a mood shifts, things that seem true in one light look different in another. I do not know what will become of my son. I hope he grows kinder. I hope he teaches his children a different model of care. But I also know this: I am not defined by his choices. I am defined by mine. If you are watching this and you have felt used or unseen or pushed aside in your own home, I want you to know a few things from my experience. You are not alone. It is not shameful to protect your life. Asking for help is not failing. There are neighbors who will hold up a casserole and a witness. There are friends who will go with you to a lawyer if you need to. There are small things you can do that keep the heart of your life intact. Locks when necessary, cameras when you must, records always. But above all, remember that dignity is not a luxury. It is a necessity. I tell this story not to make anyone feel worse about their child or their choices. Children make mistakes. Sometimes they are fixable, and sometimes they are not. I tell it so that someone else might be nudged into action before a life becomes a courtroom question. Before I close, a small word. If this story has touched you, if you recognize a pattern in your own life, there are resources and local groups that can help. I put links and contacts in the description for those who want them. Share your story in the comments if you feel called to. Sometimes telling what happened is the first step toward reclaiming what's yours. When I think of Robert now, I see him in the quiet ways he loved me. A cracked mug he put by my chair, the way he would hum while he fixed the roof. His letter was not a legal trap. It was a hand reaching over time to remind a son of something basic.
That reminder changed how people in a small courtroom heard an ordinary family's dispute. It did not change everything. It changed just enough to let me keep my life. I am older now. My hair is more silver, and my knees give me announcements on cold mornings. I still make coffee for myself and sometimes for a friend. I still take the bus to the market and bargain for tomatoes. I still have a postcard tucked under Robert's photo that says simply, "Miss you." I keep it where I can see it when light comes in the morning. And when the night comes and I feel the familiar ache of having given too much in the past, I remember the locks, the receipts, the neighbors, the pink dress, and that small folded letter. I remember that love is not what you buy, it is what you allow. I remember that protection is not theft. I remember that at times you must stand up and say, gently but firmly, "This is mine to keep." If you found this story meaningful, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. If you're new here and you want more true life stories about standing up and reclaiming dignity, subscribe and check the links in the description for organizations that support elders and caregivers.
Thank you for listening to my story.